Chapter 1. The morning light filtered through the small leaded glass panes of the McDonald home, casting soft shadows across the worn wooden floor. Nestled on the outskirts of London, the modest house was warm and well kept, each corner bearing the quiet touch of George's careful hand. Though small, the home held a curious charm, a blend of Georgian and Victorian influences with subtle hints of Greece and Scotland, tokens of two lives woven together. Georgia moved gracefully through the kitchen, her dark hair pinned in a modest chignon with stray curls framing her face, echoing the olive tone of her skin and the proud, high cheekbones that spoke of her Greek heritage. The scent of freshly baked bread mingled with a hint of thyme and lemon, common ingredients in her childhood home in Athens. She wore a simple ivory cotton dress with lace detailing at the cuffs and collar, a gift from her mother years ago, now slightly faded but cherished. Andrew McDonald, seated at the wooden table with a morning paper in hand, looked every bit the Scotsman he was. His sandy brown hair, flecked with hints of grey, and his square, rugged face bore signs of both his Highland ancestry and his years of service. He wore a woolen vest over a crisp white shirt, the buttons meticulously fastened, and a leather belt that had seen its fair share of wear. His posture was upright, respectful, as he read the paper with the quiet intensity of a man who had seen both the beauty and the darkness of life. Their 3 daughters, each a unique blend of their parents, were scattered about the room. Their eldest, Lottie, was 5, with her mother's deep, dark eyes and a delicate smile. She wore a simple blue frock Georgia had sewn herself, her hair tied with a small ribbon, and clutched a small doll while she hummed softly to herself. Beside her was Mary, 4, fair like her father, with a freckled nose and a hint of mischief in her eyes as she piled blocks on the kitchen floor. And finally, nestled in a hand-carved cradle by the window, was little Eleanor, just 7 months old, her cheeks plump and rosy, watching her sisters with a quiet curiosity that only a baby could possess. The morning was peaceful, punctuated by the soft laughter of the girls and the quiet clink of dishes. Yet beneath the warmth of the scene, Andrew sensed a change in the air, a weight. Later that day, he would be meeting with his superiors, and whispers had reached him that his diligent work as a constable had caught their attention. He couldn't help but wonder if his life, and his family's, was about to change forever. Chapter 2. As the sun climbed higher, casting a warm glow over their modest kitchen, Andrew folded his paper with a thoughtful sigh. Georgia looked up from the countertop where she was slicing a fresh loaf of bread. She had noticed his distant expression that morning, a gaze that lingered on their daughters a bit longer than usual. "Everything all right, Andrew?" she asked, her tone gentle but probing. He looked over at her, his serious expression softening just slightly. "Aye, love. Today's meeting. I'll know soon enough if they've got something new for me," he replied, the weight of unspoken possibilities in his words. George's eyes flickered with understanding. She'd sensed that the constabulary was taking more interest in her husband's work lately. A promotion would be a boon for their family, but she knew it might also bring danger and distance. She nodded, crossing the room to press a comforting hand to his shoulder. "Whatever happens, Andrew, you've earned it," she said with a smile, though her eyes held a touch of worry. Moments later, Andrew rose, adjusting his vest and glancing at his reflection in the small, slightly tarnished mirror by the doorway. Georgia watched him, her fingers gently stroking Eleanor's downy head as the baby rested in her arms. Mary and Lottie tugged at Andrew's coat, begging him for one last story before he left, as they often did. He crouched down to their level, his stern expression melting into a smile as he obliged. "Once, in the Highlands where your grandpa used to roam," he began, his voice dropping into the soft brogue of his youth. There was a fox as clever as any man you'll ever meet. He knew the hills like the back of his paw, and whenever he spotted a hunter, he'd duck into a wee cave and vanish into thin air. The girls giggled, enchanted by the tale, as Andrew kissed each on the forehead before finally standing and reaching for his coat. "Take care of your sisters," he murmured to Lottie with a wink, prompting a look of serious responsibility on her small face. He exchanged one last look with Georgia, a lingering glance, a silent exchange of both comfort and resolve, before stepping out the door and onto the cobblestone street. The cool air of early spring was crisp with the scent of freshly budding flowers, and a faint mist clung to the ground, muffling the sound of his footsteps as he walked toward the heart of the city. Chapter 3. The station was a bustling affair, filled with men in blue uniforms, officers hurrying in and out of rooms, and the faint clack of typewriters churning through reports. Andrew felt a ripple of nerves as he made his way through the narrow halls, eventually reaching the door of Inspector Caldwell's office, a stern man known for his unyielding standards and unflinching gaze. "McDonald, come in." Caldwell's voice barked as soon as Andrew knocked. Inside, the inspector sat behind a cluttered desk, papers strewn about, some bearing the wax seals of important investigations. Caldwell's gaze was piercing, and he gestured for Andrew to sit. Without much preamble, he began. "McDonald, I've been reviewing your work. You've shown sharp instincts on every case that's come your way," Caldwell said, leaning forward with his steely eyes trained on Andrew. "There's talk around the division that you're ready to take on something larger." Andrew's heart thudded in his chest. The inspector's words hinted at a reality he had hoped for, but also feared. Still, he met Caldwell's gaze with resolve. "As it happens, we've recently encountered a series of troubling cases," Caldwell continued, his voice dropping. "Murders, 3 of them so far, all with a similar signature. We believe they're connected." He pushed a set of case files across the desk toward Andrew. "If you're willing, we'd like you to lead the investigation. It's a heavy responsibility, but one I believe you're fit for." Andrew's eyes drifted to the case files, feeling the weight of each name and detail they contained before he met Caldwell's gaze again. "It would be an honor, sir," he replied, his voice steady, though his mind was racing. "Good. Keep this quiet for now. We don't need panic spreading." Caldwell's tone turned somber. "And McDonald, prepare yourself. The man behind these crimes, he's not the sort you'd wish to meet in a dark alley." The warning hung heavily in the air as Andrew rose, the files clutched under his arm. Leaving the inspector's office, he could already feel the burden settling on his shoulders. A strange sense of anticipation stirred within him, an almost grim excitement at the challenge, mingled with the chilling knowledge that his life and his family's safety might never be the same. As Andrew walked back down the corridor, he couldn't shake Caldwell's last words, "Prepare yourself." The warning lingered, lacing his new responsibility with a chill he hadn't expected. He made his way to the small office that had been cleared for him. Simple, with a large desk, 2 wooden chairs, and a narrow window overlooking the street below. The sparse furniture seemed to magnify the emptiness of the space, and Andrew felt a peculiar weight in the silence. He set the files on the desk, loosening the leather tie holding them together. The first file contained a photograph, a grainy black and white portrait of a young woman, her face pale against a dark background. Below it, her name was written in faded ink, Sarah Brooks, age 21. The other files followed the same pattern, a name, an age, and a photograph that hinted at lives cut far too short. 3 women, all found near the city's poorer quarters, their bodies showing signs of brutal, calculated violence. Andrew swallowed hard, turning the pages with measured calm. His initial task was clear. Study the details, find the patterns, piece together any fragment that might reveal the killer's identity. But as he pored over each report, he felt the peculiar weight of expectation settling onto his shoulders. Every clue he missed could mean the difference between life and death for the next potential victim. His mind pulsed with questions. What was the killer's motive? Was there a message hidden in the way he left the bodies? Had any witnesses seen a suspicious figure near the scenes? Hours passed in this silent contemplation, each file offering him a glimpse into the mind of the killer. But the work required more than just piecing together clues. It demanded collaboration. There would be long nights spent scrutinizing leads, grueling conversations with witnesses, and inevitably, moments when he'd have to face the anguish of the victims' families. It wasn't long before Sergeant Mills entered the office, breaking Andrew's intense focus. Mills was an experienced officer, a tall, steady man with a hawk-like gaze and a sharp memory for faces. Andrew had worked alongside him before and trusted him as a reliable partner. "Inspector told me you're heading up this business, eh?" Mills began, his tone gruff but respectful. "Aye," Andrew replied, nodding. "It's a dark case. 3 women so far, all found near the same quarter. We suspect it's the work of one man, but we've little to go on." Mills took a seat across from Andrew, eyes narrowing as he processed the details. "Well, I'll tell you. The city's been restless ever since the Ripper business. People are on edge, especially around Whitechapel. They fear there's another one on the loose." Andrew nodded, feeling the full gravity of his role in quelling that fear. "It's our job to keep them safe," he replied, "but we'll need to work quietly. The fewer people know, the better. No sense in stirring up panic." "Understood, sir," Mills replied. He had a way of addressing Andrew as "sir" that felt both respectful and unassuming. A subtle acknowledgement of the new rank without making it seem stiff. "Let's start with the basics," Andrew continued, drawing a crude map on a spare sheet of paper. 3 victims, all found here, here, and here. He marked each location: a darkened alley, an abandoned square, and the narrow street near a butcher's shop, all in the same crowded, twisting neighbourhood. "The patterns are loose, but the violence is deliberate. Our man's careful, almost meticulous. He's not taking chances. No witnesses, no surviving victims, and no clear connection between them that we've found." Mills leaned in, nodding with grim approval. "We'll need to canvass the area, talk to vendors, workers, even the night guards. I'll see to it that any small detail, even a boot print, makes its way back to you." Andrew looked up from the map, a faint smile of appreciation crossing his face. "Good man, Mills. With any luck, we'll have enough to begin piecing together the man behind this." With a last glance at the files, Andrew gathered his things, already feeling the length of the coming days stretching out before him. He would be facing the exhaustion of his new role, the strain of unravelling a killer's mind, and the haunting possibility that he might be too late. Yet even in the darkest moments, he reminded himself of the purpose behind his work: to protect, to prevent. The faces of his daughters lingered in his mind as he prepared for the night's patrol, each small laugh and soft voice a reminder of why he could not fail. Chapter 4. The afternoon passed in a quiet rhythm, each hour marked by the familiar routines that filled George's days. She took comfort in these small rituals, tidying the house, preparing meals, and finding small ways to entertain Lottie and Mary. But as the day wore on, she couldn't ignore the pang of unease that settled in the back of her mind, a reminder of the meeting that had taken Andrew from their home that morning. It wasn't unusual for Andrew to have long shifts, but today felt different. His gaze had been distant, his manner distracted, as though he were already carrying a burden he hadn't yet named. Georgia knew the toll his work could take, the weight of his responsibilities, the violence and hardship he'd encountered on the streets. She had seen it reflected in his face, in the quiet moments they shared after the girls were asleep, when he would sit beside her, his eyes dimmed with memories he rarely shared. She found herself looking out the window more often that day, her gaze trailing down the cobbled path, half expecting to see him striding toward the door. But the streets remained empty, save for the occasional passer-by. With a soft sigh, she returned to Eleanor, who lay nestled in her arms, cooing softly as her tiny hands reached out to grasp at George's curls. "Oh, my little angel," she murmured, pressing a gentle kiss to Eleanor's brow. "Your papa will be home soon, and he'll tell us all about his day. He's just very busy now, doing important work." But George's words held a faint note of uncertainty, a subtle tremor that she hoped her daughters couldn't sense. She shifted her focus to the warmth of the kitchen, the heart of their small home. The walls were painted a soft, welcoming shade, and on the windowsill a handful of potted herbs grew: thyme, rosemary, and basil, small reminders of her childhood in Greece. In the afternoons, she would teach Lottie and Mary the names of each plant, letting them touch the leaves and breathe in the earthy, fragrant scents. As she prepared supper, Lottie and Mary hovered nearby, watching her with curious eyes. Lottie, the more serious of the two, took it upon herself to help, reaching up to pass her mother a potato or an onion from the wooden bin by the stove. Mary, meanwhile, was engrossed in a game of her own making, arranging their few wooden toys into little scenes that only she seemed to understand. "Mamma, do you think Papa's working with the big bosses today?" Lottie asked, her voice quiet but determined, her little face pinched with a seriousness that was unusual for a 5-year-old. Georgia looked down, her heart squeezing with both pride and a bittersweet sorrow. Lottie was already so much like her father, steady, observant, with a strength that made Georgia feel as if she were peering into the future. "Yes, darling," Georgia replied, brushing a stray curl from Lottie's face. "Papa has some very important things to do at work. He's keeping people safe." Mary looked up at this, her wide eyes sparkling with innocent curiosity. "Will he tell us stories again when he comes home?" she asked, her voice hopeful. Georgia smiled, though she felt a heaviness in her chest. "Of course, my love. You know how much he loves telling you stories." But as she spoke, Georgia couldn't shake the feeling that the days of carefree stories and laughter might be slipping away. Andrew's work, which had always carried an element of danger, now seemed to reach into their home in a way it hadn't before. And for the first time, she wondered how much more he might have to sacrifice to keep their family safe. Night began to fall, and Georgia lit the small oil lamp in the sitting room, casting a warm glow over the space as she settled Eleanor in her cradle. She glanced at the clock on the mantel, her thoughts drifting to Andrew once more. What will this new role bring him, she wondered. Would he grow distant, his mind burdened with horrors he couldn't share? Or would this be a path towards something better, a chance for him to rise above the dangers, to protect not only strangers, but also the ones he held dear? As she tucked Lottie and Mary into bed, each of them whispering their goodnight wishes for their father's safe return, Georgia felt the weight of both hope and worry. She stayed in their room a little longer than usual, stroking Lottie's hair as she drifted off to sleep, and soothing Mary when she stirred restlessly. Finally, when the house was quiet, she returned to the kitchen, where she busied herself with small, mindless tasks, wiping down the counter, checking the locks on the doors, making sure everything was in its place. Her gaze returned to the window one last time, watching as the city lights flickered in the distance. And in that moment, She realized that Andrew's absence had become something more than a mere inconvenience. It had begun to etch itself into the fabric of their lives, as steady and as inevitable as the passing of time. The soft creak of the door startled Georgia, pulling her from her quiet contemplation. She turned to see Andrew stepping inside, his frame silhouetted against the dim light of the hallway. A wave of relief washed over her, and she instinctively moved to embrace him, cradling Eleanor in her arms as he enveloped them both in a warm embrace. "Georgia," he murmured, his voice a blend of exhaustion and tenderness. "I'm home." "Mama, it's Papa." Lottie's sleepy voice piped up from the bedroom, her eyes wide with the joy of recognition. Georgia stepped back to take a proper look at him, her heart swelling with love as she took in the sight of her husband, his uniform slightly rumpled, but still sharp. The lines of fatigue etched around his eyes spoke of a long day, but the smile that broke across his face was genuine. "Did you have a good day?" she asked, keeping her voice soft so as not to rouse Mary too much. Andrew nodded, kneeling to greet Lottie as she rushed into the room, arms outstretched. "It's good to see you, my little lady," he said, lifting her into his arms with a chuckle. Lottie beamed up at him, her small hands clutching his collar as if she feared he might disappear again. "Did you catch the bad man, Papa?" Andrew hesitated for just a moment, glancing at Georgia, who could see the tension in his shoulders. "Not yet, but we're working on it. I've got some very smart people helping me." As Georgia settled Eleanor in her cradle, she felt the familiar knot of worry tighten in her stomach, but she pushed it aside, focusing on the happiness of the moment. "You're home now, and that's what matters." After Lottie had settled back into her own spot, Andrew turned to Georgia, a serious look crossing his face. "I have some news. I've got tomorrow off, just for the day. I thought we could spend some time together as a family, go to the park, have a picnic, whatever you'd like." Georgia's heart lifted at the thought. "Really? A whole day together?" The prospect of a day free from the burdens of the outside world brought a lightness to her chest, and for the first time in what felt like ages, she allowed herself to smile. "Yes," Andrew replied, his eyes brightening. "A proper family day. We can let the girls run wild and enjoy the sunshine. We deserve it." "Oh, Andrew, that sounds wonderful," she exclaimed, her enthusiasm bubbling over. "I'll prepare sandwiches and we can pack some of those biscuits you like. The girls will be so excited." "Just be sure to keep Mary from wandering off." Andrew chuckled, his eyes twinkling as he thought of their youngest, who had a knack for exploring every nook and cranny. Their laughter filled the small kitchen, momentarily pushing the weight of the world away. But the joy was short-lived, for Andrew's expression shifted again, the smile faltering as he continued. "But after tomorrow, I'll be at Scotland Yard for a few days. There are meetings about the case, important discussions. I wish it could be longer, but they need me there." The light in George's heart dimmed slightly, and she felt a familiar pang of fear settle in her chest. "A few days? Are you sure it's necessary?" He reached for her hand, the warmth of his touch steadying her. "I have to go, love. There are decisions that need to be made, strategies to discuss. The city is on edge, and we need to bring this man to justice." "But you'll be safe, right?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, the vulnerability she felt laid bare. "You will come back to us? Always," he vowed, his gaze locking onto hers with an intensity that sent a shiver through her. "I promise I'll be careful, and after tomorrow we'll have more time together. I'll make it up to you and the girls." Georgia nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She wanted to be strong, to show him that she could handle the weight of his work, but the thought of him leaving again, of the dangers he faced, unsettled her. "Just promise me you'll keep us in your thoughts," she said softly, her eyes glistening. "Every moment," he assured her, pulling her close once more. "And tomorrow we'll make it the best day ever. Just us." With a final squeeze, Andrew stepped back, his spirit lifted by their shared promise of a day to come. As they settled in for the evening, laughter bubbled back into the air, filling their small home with warmth and hope. Together, they tucked Lottie back into bed, telling her stories of brave knights and far-off lands, the worries of the world fading away, if only for the moment. That night, as Georgia lay beside Eleanor in the cradle, she let herself dream of the day ahead. It would be a chance to forget, if only for a little while, the darkness that loomed just beyond their door. And with that thought, she drifted into a peaceful sleep, trusting in Andrew's promise to return to her, to their girls, and to the life they were building together. Chapter 5. The morning sun poured through the kitchen window, casting a golden glow over the modest home of the McDonald family. Georgia bustled about, preparing for their day together. The smell of freshly baked bread filled the air, mingling with the sweet scent of honey as she spread a thick layer over slices destined for their picnic. The soft sounds of giggles and pattering feet echoed through the hall as Lottie and Mary played with their toys, the excitement of the day fueling their energy. "Are you ready, girls?" Georgia called out, glancing at the clock. "We don't want to miss the best part of the day." "Ready, Mama," Lottie exclaimed, her eyes sparkling with anticipation. Mary nodded vigorously, a bright smile lighting up her cherubic face. Andrew emerged from the bedroom, adjusting his collar, his presence filling the room with warmth. "What's all this commotion?" he teased, a wide grin spreading across his face as he surveyed the busy scene. "Are my ladies prepared for a grand adventure?" "Absolutely," Lottie declared, puffing out her chest as if she were already a great explorer. "We'll have the best picnic in the whole world." "Then let's be off," Andrew said, sweeping Lottie into his arms while Georgia picked up the picnic basket, laden with their carefully prepared treats. As they stepped outside, the world burst into life around them. The cobbled streets of their neighborhood buzzed with activity, vendors calling out their wares, children laughing as they chased each other, and the distant clatter of horse-drawn carriages. The McDonald family made their way toward the park, a charming expanse of greenery nestled amidst the bustling city. When they arrived, the park revealed itself as a beautiful oasis. Verdant trees swayed gently in the breeze, their leaves whispering secrets of the day, while flowers bloomed in vibrant colors, painting the landscape with shades of spring. Georgia inhaled deeply, letting the sense of nature fill her lungs, her worries melting away in the warmth of the sun. "Look, Mama, can we feed the ducks?" Mary pointed excitedly at the pond, where a group of ducks paddled lazily across the water's surface. "Of course, sweetheart," Georgia said, smiling as they approached the pond. They settled on the grass, and Andrew helped Lottie and Mary break pieces of bread into smaller bits, tossing them to the eager ducks that quacked and waddled closer. For a blissful hour, the worries of the world faded into the background. Laughter erupted as Mary squealed with delight, the ducks quacking back as if joining in the fun. Andrew watched, his heart swelling with pride and joy, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for this day with his family. After feeding the ducks, they spread their picnic blanket under a large oak tree, its sprawling branches providing the perfect shade. Georgia set out their lunch, sandwiches, fruit, and a few sweet biscuits, each item carefully chosen to please the girls' appetites. "Now tell me about your adventures while I was at work," Andrew encouraged, leaning back against the tree as Lottie animatedly recounted tales of her playtime with Mary and Eleanor, her imagination transforming the mundane into grand stories of bravery and heroism. As the sun climbed higher, casting dappled light through the leaves, Georgia felt a wave of contentment wash over her. Here, in this moment, surrounded by the laughter of her children and the warmth of Andrew's presence, the fears that had lingered in her heart seemed to dissipate like mist in the morning light. After lunch, they took a stroll through the park, hand in hand, with the girls darting ahead, their laughter echoing through the air. They played games of tag and hide and seek, each moment filled with pure joy. The world around them felt alive, vibrant with colour and sound, a stark contrast to the weight of worry they often carried. As the sun began to dip low in the sky, casting long shadows across the park, Andrew gathered his family close, his heart full. Before we head home, let's take a moment to just enjoy the sunset, shall we? They found a small hill that overlooked the park where they sat together, their fingers intertwined. Georgia leaned against Andrew, resting her head on his shoulder as the sky transformed into a canvas of oranges and pinks, a breathtaking backdrop for their family. Tomorrow will bring its challenges, Andrew said softly, his voice a gentle murmur as he wrapped an arm around Georgia, pulling her close. But today has been a reminder of what we fight for. Georgia nodded, feeling the weight of his words. She turned to face him, her heart swelling with love. We are so lucky, Andrew. Thank you for this day. He smiled down at her, and in that moment, the worries of their world seemed far away. You deserve days like this. All of you do. As the sun sank beneath the horizon, they began their walk home, the shadows lengthening around them. Lottie and Mary giggled, recounting their adventures as they trailed behind, while Andrew and Georgia shared quiet glances, smiles playing on their lips. Once home, they settled the girls into their bedtime routine, the warmth of the day lingering in their hearts. After kisses and soft goodnights, Georgia turned to Andrew, the light of the oil lamp casting a soft glow in the dim room. Tomorrow I'll be busy, Andrew reminded her, a hint of regret in his voice. Georgia stepped closer, wrapping her arms around him. I know, but we have tonight. Andrew's gaze softened, and he pulled her closer, their lips brushing together in a tender kiss that deepened with unspoken desire. They moved to their bedroom, where the world outside faded away, leaving only the warmth of their connection. As they settled into bed together, Georgia felt a spark of hope light within her. The connection they shared felt stronger than ever, and in the stillness of the night, they found solace in each other's arms. The laughter of their children echoed softly in the background, a reminder of their love, their life, and the possibility of new beginnings. In that moment, with the warmth of Andrew's body against hers and the soft cadence of his heartbeat lulling her to sleep, Georgia let her worries drift away. Instead, she allowed herself to imagine the future, an ever-expanding family filled with love and laughter, even amidst the uncertainty that awaited them. As they drifted into sleep, dreams intertwined, carrying whispers of hope and possibility, igniting a flicker of life within her, a spark that could lead to new beginnings, to another child, and the adventure of parenthood once more. Chapter 6. The following morning, the air in Scotland Yard was thick with tension. Andrew strode through the bustling corridors, the familiar sights of the station overshadowed by a sense of foreboding. His mind was still filled with the warmth of the family day he had shared with Georgia and the girls, but as he approached the meeting room, the weight of his responsibilities settled heavily on his shoulders. Inside, a group of detectives and officers gathered around a large table strewn with reports and photographs. The atmosphere was electric, filled with the low murmur of urgent conversations and the sound of pens scratching on paper. Andrew took a deep breath, steeling himself as he stepped into the room, greeted by the concerned faces of his colleagues. "McDonald," Inspector Reed called out, beckoning him over. "We've just received news. There's been another murder. Multiple victims this time." Andrew felt his stomach twist as he took a seat at the table, the gravity of the situation settling over him like a heavy cloak. He scanned the faces of his colleagues, each one reflecting the same mix of dread and determination. Where? What do we know? Reed laid out the details, his voice steady yet urgent. In a small lodging house in Whitechapel, 4 bodies discovered this morning, all women, similar patterns to the previous murders. He pushed a series of photographs across the table. The images were graphic, brutal, and Andrew's heart sank as he took in the horror of the scene. "Any connections?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "All victims were last seen near the docks in the days leading up to their deaths," Reed replied. "They all lived in similar circumstances. Vulnerable women, likely engaged in survival trades. We suspect the killer is targeting those who are least likely to be missed." The implications of Reed's words hit Andrew like a blow. He thought of Georgia and their girls, the vulnerability of women in their society, all too apparent in the cold realities of the city. The fear that had crept into his heart since the first murder now gripped him tighter. "We need to increase patrols in the area and engage the local constables," Andrew suggested, his mind racing with possibilities. "We must establish a liaison with the community, get information, and reassure them we're taking this seriously. We can't let fear rule their lives." "Agreed," Reed said, nodding. "We also need to analyze patterns. We're dealing with someone who is methodical, who knows how to blend in. The press will be all over this. We need to control the narrative." As the meeting continued, the discussions became increasingly frantic, strategies and leads thrown around like confetti. Andrew's thoughts drifted momentarily to Georgia, to the quiet safety of their home, and to the laughter of their daughters. The stark contrast between his domestic life and the brutal realities of his work felt like a chasm that widened with each passing moment. Finally, after what felt like hours, the meeting concluded, leaving Andrew with a heavy heart. He gathered his notes and made his way back to his office, the corridors of Scotland Yard feeling more oppressive than ever. He knew that time was of the essence, and the stakes had never been higher. As he reached his desk, he began to organize the information they had on the victims, trying to find any connections that might lead them closer to the killer. He worked tirelessly, poring over reports, witness statements, and photographs. Each piece of information painted a haunting picture of desperation and loss, fueling his determination to bring justice to those who could no longer speak for themselves. Hours later, just as the sun dipped low in the sky, Andrew received a call from Inspector Reed, summoning him back to the meeting room. The urgency in Reed's voice sent a chill down his spine as he hurried to join his colleagues. "McDonald, we've just received a crucial lead," Reed announced, his expression grave. "A witness has come forward, someone who claims to have seen a man loitering near the lodging house before the bodies were discovered. We need to follow this up immediately." "Where can we find this witness?" Andrew asked, his heart racing at the prospect of new hope. "In a pub not far from the crime scene. He frequents the area and seems to know more than he's letting on." Andrew nodded, adrenaline coursing through him. "Let's not waste any time. I'll head there now." As he left the station, the weight of the city's fears bore down on him. He knew that lives hung in the balance, and the urgency of his task felt like a drumbeat in his chest. He stepped into the darkening streets, the flickering gas lamps illuminating his path as he made his way to the pub, determined to uncover the truth and put an end to the terror that had gripped their city. The streets of London felt alive with an undercurrent of tension as Andrew navigated the labyrinth of alleys and thoroughfares leading to the pub. The sky had deepened into a brooding grey, the clouds heavy with the promise of rain. He clutched his coat tighter around him, not just against the chill, but as a shield against the gnawing worry that clawed at the edges of his mind. As he approached the pub, a dilapidated establishment tucked between more prominent buildings, the raucous sounds of laughter and shouting spilled out into the street. Andrew pushed open the creaky door, the faint scent of stale beer and sweat wafting around him. The dim light illuminated the faces of patrons, many of whom seemed lost in their own worlds, oblivious to the dark cloud gathering outside. He spotted the witness, a scruffy man nursing a drink at the bar. Andrew's instincts told him that this was the man who could help turn the tide in the investigation. He approached with purpose, determination guiding his steps. "Excuse me," Andrew said, placing his hand lightly on the man's shoulder. "Are you Benjamin Moore?" The man turned, his eyes narrowing suspiciously. "Who wants to know?" "I'm Detective Andrew McDonald. I need to ask you about what you saw near the lodging house where the murders occurred." Benjamin shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting around the room. "I don't know anything," he muttered, his voice low. "Just leave me be." "Please," Andrew pressed, trying to keep his tone calm. "People are dying. Any information you have could save lives. I need your help." The man's expression hardened, and he took a long swig from his glass. "I don't want to get involved. You lot always forget about the little people when it's all over. Just leave me alone." Andrew felt frustration surge within him, but he kept his composure. "I understand your hesitation, but this is not just a matter of police business. These women were mothers, daughters, sisters. They deserve justice." Benjamin scoffed, looking away. "Justice? What's that ever done for me? I'm not sticking my neck out." Andrew sighed, realizing he was fighting an uphill battle. He pressed on, asking about the man he was supposed to have seen, but Benjamin offered nothing but vague recollections and reluctant mumblings. It was a dead end, and Andrew felt the weight of the night bearing down on him. He moved to another table, where a group of men huddled together, their laughter suddenly quieting as he approached. "Excuse me, gentlemen," he said, forcing a smile. "I'm looking for anyone who might have seen a man hanging around the area of the lodging house recently." One of the men leaned back in his chair, arms crossed defiantly. "Why would we tell you anything? You lot don't care about us." "Please, we're trying to solve a murder case," Andrew replied, his patience wearing thin. "You could help prevent more deaths." But they dismissed him with a wave of the hand, their camaraderie growing more boisterous as they turned their backs on him. Andrew felt the frustration boiling inside him. This was a matter of life and death, yet he was met with apathy and resistance. After a few more fruitless attempts, Andrew stepped outside, the cool evening air biting at his skin. He rubbed a hand over his stubbled jaw, weighing his options. The night was wearing on, and the last thing he wanted was to return home with nothing to show for his efforts. He knew Georgia would be worried, and the thought of leaving her and the girls without answers felt like a weight he couldn't bear. As he strolled down the street, he caught sight of a shadow slipping around the corner, a figure cloaked in the darkening streets. His instincts ignited. Andrew followed, heart pounding in his chest. The figure moved quickly, darting between alleys and side streets, just out of reach. "Hey, stop!" Andrew shouted, adrenaline coursing through him. He pushed himself to run faster, but the figure was nimble, disappearing into the night. He rounded the corner, skidding to a halt in an alley. The echo of hurried footsteps faded into silence, leaving him alone in the dark. He glanced around, but the figure was gone, vanished into the shadows. Anger mixed with frustration surged within him. It could have been the killer, or at least someone connected to him. Andrew leaned against the damp brick wall, catching his breath. The encounter had been too close, and he realised that he couldn't risk going home tonight. He needed to regroup, to gather his thoughts and plan his next move. The uncertainty felt suffocating, but he had no choice. With resolve, he turned and made his way to a nearby inn, a place he had often seen but never entered. The flickering light from the windows offered a semblance of safety, and as he stepped inside, the warmth enveloped him. The innkeeper, a stout man with a bushy moustache, eyed him curiously. "What'll it be, mate?" "A room for the night," Andrew said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. "I've got work to do." "Right then." The innkeeper handed him a brass key, its weight a reminder of the burden he carried. "Room 6. Can I get you anything else?" Andrew shook his head, already turning to head up the creaking stairs. He needed solitude, a chance to process what had happened. Once in his room, he locked the door and leaned against it, letting the quiet settle around him. He took a moment to gather his thoughts, the events of the evening replaying in his mind. The uncooperative witnesses, the fleeting shadow. He felt the urgency of his task more than ever. The killer was out there, still at large, and he needed to find a way to connect the dots before more lives were lost. Pulling out his notebook, he began jotting down details and observations, piecing together the puzzle in the dim light of the room. Every moment counted, and Andrew vowed that he would not let this night pass without making progress. He was determined to protect his family, to bring justice to those who had suffered, and to ensure that the city would not live in fear any more. Chapter 7. The evening air settled gently over the McDonald home, a comforting warmth radiating from the hearth where a small fire crackled, casting flickering shadows against the walls. Georgia nestled on the sofa, her heart a mix of longing and worry for Andrew. She had expected him home by now, and the quiet of the house felt heavier without his presence. Lottie and Mary played quietly on the floor, their laughter punctuating the stillness as they built a tower of wooden blocks, each piece meticulously balanced. Georgia couldn't help but smile at their innocence, at how their world was still filled with wonder, even amidst the shadows of the city. "Careful, Lottie," Mary exclaimed, her eyes wide with anticipation as her sister placed another block on top of the tower. "If you knock it over, I won't have a castle anymore." "Don't worry, Mary. I'm the best tower builder ever," Lottie proclaimed, her small brow furrowing in concentration. Georgia watched them, her heart swelling with love. She felt an ache in her chest, a reminder of Andrew's absence, but she also felt grateful for the vibrant life they had created together. The girls were her joy, their laughter the music of her days. Just as Mary reached for another block, the sudden sound of a loud thud interrupted their play, followed by a sharp gasp from Lottie as the tower collapsed. "Oh no!" Lottie cried, her disappointment palpable. "I worked so hard on that." "It's okay, Lottie," Georgia said, kneeling down to comfort her. "You can build it again, and this time it'll be even taller." Lottie sniffed, her bottom lip quivering before a smile slowly crept back onto her face. "Really?" "Of course," Georgia assured her. "Let's make it a team effort. You can help me, and we can build the tallest tower in all of London." Mary clapped her hands in delight. "Yes, we can make it a castle with a moat." As they worked together to gather the blocks and rebuild, Georgia felt a sense of peace wash over her. The girls were her anchors, grounding her amid the uncertainty that lingered with Andrew's work. She watched as their little hands meticulously stacked the blocks, giggling as they created a new structure. "Do you think Papa will like our castle?" Lottie asked, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "Absolutely. He'll be so proud of you both," Georgia replied, her heart warming at the thought of Andrew's reaction. "And we can save a special spot for him at the top." Once the tower was rebuilt, complete with a makeshift moat drawn with a piece of chalk from their drawing set, the girls took a step back to admire their creation. Georgia smiled at the sight. Two proud little girls standing beside their work, arms crossed with a sense of accomplishment. "Shall we make a tea party for the castle?" Mary suggested, her imagination ignited. "We can have biscuits and honey for the guests." "Great idea," Lottie squealed, her earlier disappointment forgotten. "Let's pretend we're princesses." Georgia laughed, her heart lightening at their enthusiasm. "Then I suppose I shall be the queen who serves the tea." As they gathered plates and cups, Georgia couldn't help but feel a pang of loneliness for Andrew, wishing he were there to share in their joy. But she pushed those thoughts aside, focusing on the moment. Laughter filled the room again as the girls arranged their toys at the castle for the grand tea party. Later, as they settled around the small table they had set up, Georgia poured imaginary tea into tiny cups, making a show of careful precision. "And for our special guest, the king, we have the finest honey biscuits," she declared, gesturing grandly. "Yay!" Lottie and Mary cheered, their eyes wide with delight as they pretended to nibble on invisible treats. As the evening deepened, Georgia guided her daughters through games and stories, weaving tales of adventure and bravery, of heroes and mythical creatures. The worries of the outside world faded into the background, replaced by the joy that radiated from their shared laughter. Eventually the girls began to yawn, their eyelids drooping as the clock ticked closer to bedtime. Georgia helped them brush their teeth and put on their nightgowns, their soft, sleepy voices murmuring about the day's events. "Can we build another castle tomorrow, Mama?" Mary asked, her head resting against Georgia's shoulder as she tucked her into bed. "Of course, my sweet," Georgia whispered, smoothing Mary's hair back from her forehead. "We'll build the grandest castle in all of London, and your father will be so proud." Lottie, already tucked in, chimed in. "And we can have a real tea party too, with biscuits." "Absolutely," Georgia replied, her heart swelling with affection. "Now close your eyes and dream of all the adventures we'll have." Once the girls were nestled in bed, Georgia quietly left the room, her heart still heavy with concern for Andrew. She made her way to the living room, where the fire had burned low, leaving a soft glow in the dim room. She settled onto the sofa, wrapping herself in a blanket, her mind racing with thoughts of her husband and the dangerous work that lay ahead of him. As she sat in the quiet of their home, the memories of the day flooded her mind. The laughter, the joy, the love that filled their little world. She hoped that Andrew was safe and that they would soon return to their normal lives, where such darkness couldn't intrude. But she knew the reality of their situation. They were living in a city filled with shadows, where danger lurked just beyond the light. In the stillness, Georgia whispered a silent prayer for Andrew's safety and the well-being of their family. The night stretched on, and she closed her eyes, allowing the warmth of the fire to soothe her, hoping that when morning came, the world would feel just a little brighter, and that Andrew would be there with them once again. In Chapter 8, the air was thick with dread as Andrew walked the cobbled streets of Whitechapel, retracing his steps with renewed determination. He had received a tip from a local constable about a shadowy figure seen near the lodging house, someone who might fit the profile of the killer. The weight of his responsibilities pressed heavily on him, but he was driven by a singular focus: to protect his family and bring justice to the victims. As he approached a narrow alleyway, Andrew's heart raced with anticipation. The dim light from a gas lamp flickered against the wet cobblestones, casting long shadows that seemed to dance in the darkness. He felt an instinctual pull, sensing that he was close to uncovering the truth. "Stop!" Andrew shouted as he spotted a figure darting into the alley. The man's silhouette was gaunt, his movements furtive, and a primal urge to chase surged through Andrew as he pursued the shadowy figure. "I'm a police officer. Stop, or I'll—" Before he could finish, the figure turned, a flash of recognition in the man's eyes sending a shiver down Andrew's spine. The killer, the monster who had wreaked havoc upon the city, was standing before him, the man who had snuffed out innocent lives without remorse. "You!" the killer hissed, his voice low and menacing, eyes narrowing. "McDonald." Andrew's pulse quickened, adrenaline surging through his veins. "You're under arrest for murder," he shouted, his voice echoing off the brick walls. The man let out a chilling laugh, a sound that curdled Andrew's blood. "Arrest me? You think it's that simple?" He began to back away slowly, a sinister smile stretching across his face. "You're nothing but a pawn in this game." Andrew lunged forward, but the killer was too quick, slipping into the shadows, disappearing as if he were a ghost. "Get back here!" Andrew yelled, frustration boiling over as he sprinted after him, but the alley twisted and turned, leading him deeper into the labyrinth of London's dark underbelly. He skidded to a stop, panting heavily, searching for any sign of the man. But all that remained was the echo of his own breath, the chilling realization that the killer had evaded him yet again. Returning to the inn, Andrew's mind raced with thoughts of his family. That encounter had rattled him more than he cared to admit, and now the fear for Georgia and the girls gnawed at him. He needed to warn them, to ensure they were safe. As he entered his room, a flicker of movement caught his eye. A small envelope lay on the table, its edges worn as though it had been hurriedly tossed aside. His heart dropped as he picked it up, the weight of it heavy in his hands. The seal was unbroken, but the air was thick with dread. With trembling fingers, he tore it open and read the note inside. The handwriting was jagged and erratic, filled with malice. "Detective McDonald, you think you can protect your family. Your little girls are as vulnerable as the others, and I see you are becoming a nuisance. Consider this a warning. Back off, or they will pay the price for your foolishness. You cannot catch me. You will never catch me. Your shadow." The words swam in front of his eyes, a whirlwind of fear and rage igniting within him. Andrew's heart pounded against his chest like a drum, the threat stark and real. He quickly scanned the room, fear creeping over him as he imagined what the killer might be capable of. They were in danger, and he hadn't been there to protect them. Without wasting a moment, he left the inn, determination fueling his steps. He needed to return home, to ensure Georgia and the girls were safe. But as he turned down the main road, a darker thought crept into his mind. What if the killer had already found them? Meanwhile, back in their cozy home, Georgia sat in the glow of the dying fire, a sense of unease settling over her. She had been reading a book to the girls, their heads resting against her as they drifted into sleep. Just as she was about to close the book and tuck them in for the night, there was a soft rustling sound from the hallway. Curiosity piqued, Georgia rose quietly, peeking through the door. She had expected to see Andrew returning home at last, but instead she found an envelope resting on the doormat. Her heart raced, a strange chill creeping up her spine as she knelt to retrieve it. The envelope bore no return address, and with shaking hands, she opened it. Inside was another letter, this one unmistakably penned by the same hand as Andrew's letter. A sense of dread filled her as she unfolded it and began to read. "Dear Mrs. McDonald, your husband is a fool if he thinks he can stop me. I see the happiness in your home, and I relish the thought of tearing it apart. The time is coming when you will wish you had never crossed paths with him. He is not the only one with something to lose. You and your precious girls are in danger. Know this. I am always watching. Your shadow." The world around her seemed to tilt as the words burned into her mind. Georgia staggered back against the doorframe, her heart racing, each beat echoing the panic swelling within her. She pressed the letter against her chest, fear for her family overwhelming her. "Andrew," she gasped, her voice trembling. She had to find him, to warn him of the danger that now loomed over them all. The weight of the letter clung to Georgia like a shroud, and panic surged within her as she clutched it tightly in her hand. She could feel her heart racing as she rushed to the window, peering out into the shadowy street, praying for Andrew's safe return. She was still trying to process the chilling words of the killer when the sound of a key turning in the lock pulled her from her spiraling thoughts. The door swung open, and there he was, Andrew, looking weary yet resolute, his brow furrowed with worry. Relief flooded through Georgia, but it was quickly overshadowed by the urgency of the moment. She hurried forward, enveloping him in a tight embrace, feeling the strength of his frame against her own. "Georgia," he murmured, his voice hoarse. "Are the girls all right?" "They're sleeping," she said, pulling back to look into his eyes. "But I received a letter." Andrew's expression hardened as he reached for the note, reading it swiftly. She could see the tension in his jaw as he absorbed the threat that had been made against them. "We can't stay here," he said firmly, his voice low. "We have to leave London. We need to get the girls to safety." "Where will we go?" Georgia asked, her heart racing again, not from fear, but from the uncertainty of their future. "My family estate in the Highlands," he replied, his voice steady. "It's remote and secure. We'll be safe there." Within the hour, they hastily gathered their belongings, packing essentials into a couple of satchels. As the clock struck midnight, they set out into the fog-laden streets of London, the city seeming to hold its breath in anticipation of the darkness that loomed. Chapter 9. They made their way to the train station, the cool air biting at their cheeks. Andrew held George's hand tightly as they navigated the bustling platform, his presence a comforting anchor in the chaos. The steam engine huffed and puffed, a rhythmic sound that filled the night with promise. Once aboard, they settled into a cramped compartment, the flickering gaslight illuminating their worried expressions. The rhythmic clatter of the train wheels against the tracks was a lullaby that soothed the girls into a restless slumber, their little heads lolling against their mother. Georgia gazed out of the window, the blurred shapes of the passing countryside barely visible through the veil of her worry. As dawn broke, they arrived at a quaint station surrounded by rolling hills and fields that seemed to stretch endlessly. The air here was crisp and clean, a sharp contrast to the oppressive smog of the city. A sturdy cart awaited them, and Andrew loaded their belongings with a practiced ease, the weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders. As they travelled along the winding roads, the girls began to stir, rubbing their eyes as the landscape unfolded around them, wild and beautiful. Georgia pointed out the distant mountains and the sprawling green meadows dotted with sheep, hoping to distract them from the anxiety lingering in the air. "Look, Lottie, there are sheep," Georgia said, her voice bright with feigned enthusiasm. "Do you see how fluffy they are?" "Can we pet them, Mama?" Lottie asked, her curiosity piqued. "Perhaps, my love," Georgia replied, smiling at her daughter. "When we get settled, maybe we can explore." As they ventured further into the Highlands, the weight of fear began to lift, replaced by the beauty of their surroundings. The cart jostled along the rocky path, and the sound of rushing water filled the air as they crossed a small bridge over a glimmering stream. For a moment, Georgia allowed herself to breathe deeply, savouring the sweet scent of pine and earth. Upon arriving at the estate, a majestic stone structure perched atop a gentle hill, Georgia felt a sense of relief wash over her. The sprawling grounds were dotted with trees and wildflowers, and the views of the distant mountains were breathtaking. This was a place that felt safe, a sanctuary for her and the girls. Andrew led them inside, and the warmth of the hearth welcomed them, a stark contrast to the chill of the journey. For the first few days, they settled into a routine of sorts. Andrew stayed with them, ensuring the girls felt secure as they explored their new surroundings. He taught them about the flora and fauna, and they delighted in chasing butterflies in the meadow, while he kept a watchful eye, a comforting presence that reassured Georgia. Yet as the days wore on, Andrew grew restless, his mind constantly drifting back to London. The shadows of his duties weighed heavily on him, and the darkness that had threatened their lives loomed ever larger. One evening, as they gathered around the fireplace, Andrew received a telegram that turned his world upside down. George's heart sank as he read the message, his face paling. "What is it?" she asked, anxiety clawing at her. "It's from one of the constables," he said, his voice strained. "Our cottage, it's been burnt down." The realization crashed over her like a wave, the fear that had once seemed distant now looming large. "What does this mean for us, Andrew?" she whispered, dread settling deep within her gut. "It means the killer knows where we are," he replied, his gaze intense. "I can't stay here while you're in danger. I have to go back to London to confront him once and for all." "No," Georgia breathed, panic rising. "You can't. It's too dangerous. What if he comes after us?" "I have to protect you," Andrew said firmly, gripping her shoulders. "I can't allow him to threaten our family any longer. I need to end this." "Please, don't do this," she pleaded, tears brimming in her eyes. "What if something happens to you?" "I have to do this for you and the girls. I'll be careful, I promise," he assured her, though the uncertainty in his eyes betrayed his own fears. With heavy hearts, they embraced, knowing that this could be the last moment they shared as a family for some time. Georgia clung to him, wishing she could somehow keep him safe within her grasp. But as dawn broke, the inevitability of his departure loomed, each second stretching painfully until they finally faced the moment they had both dreaded. Andrew kissed each of the girls goodbye, his love wrapping around them like a shield. He looked back at Georgia, his heart aching. "I'll return to you," he vowed. "I will end this." With that, he mounted a horse and rode off, his figure growing smaller until he was just a shadow on the horizon. Georgia stood at the door, clutching the girls, fear settling in her heart. The Highlands were beautiful, but now they felt desolate without Andrew by her side. As she closed the door and turned back to the warmth of the hearth, she steeled herself for the days ahead, the shadows of uncertainty now stretching long across the bright landscape. She knew the battle was far from over, and she would wait for him to return, to bring their family back together again. Chapter 10. The days stretched on in the Scottish Highlands, the beauty of the landscape juxtaposed against the heavy burden in George's heart. The estate, a grand structure of weathered stone with sprawling grounds, became both a refuge and a reminder of the uncertainty that loomed. It was a place steeped in history, with creaking floorboards and walls adorned with portraits of stern ancestors, their eyes following Georgia as she moved about the house. The early autumn weather was unpredictable. Mornings dawned crisp and bright, the air cool and invigorating, yet by afternoon heavy clouds would roll in, blanketing the sky in shades of grey. Rain would often follow, drenching the grounds in a silvery mist that clung to the air. Georgia found herself watching the weather from the tall windows, the shifting clouds echoing the tumult in her heart. Inside the estate, she had settled into a semblance of routine with the girls, but the joy of exploration felt overshadowed by the ever-present worry for Andrew. Lottie and Clara, unaware of the full extent of their father's danger, revelled in the freedom of their surroundings. They delighted in running through the fields, their laughter ringing out like music against the sombre backdrop. The gardens were wild and untamed, with heather blooming in shades of purple and yellow, and the surrounding hills rolled away into the distance, covered in a blanket of green and bronze. Georgia would often sit on a stone bench outside, watching the girls gather wildflowers, their small fingers deftly plucking blooms and weaving them into crowns. "Look, Mama!" Lottie would exclaim, her face beaming as she presented her creation. "I made this for you." Georgia would take the crown, placing it gently upon her head, a fragile thing of beauty that brought a fleeting smile to her lips. But even in these moments of joy, the weight of Andrew's absence lingered, a heavy silence settling in the spaces where he once filled their home with laughter and love. As the days turned into weeks, the storms grew more frequent, battering the windows with relentless rain and wind that howled like a wounded animal. The chill crept into their bones, and the once warm hearth felt inadequate against the encroaching cold. Georgia found herself constantly tending the fire, gathering logs and kindling, all the while keeping an ear out for news from Andrew. Each morning, she would walk to the end of the estate's long driveway, scanning the horizon for the sight of a horseman approaching. But the only visitors were the occasional farmers who came to trade, their faces lined with worry and their eyes reflecting the fear that had gripped the region. News of the killer's terror had spread, and even in this remote corner of the world, the shadows of danger loomed large. The evenings were the hardest. After tucking the girls into bed, Georgia would sit alone in the parlour, the flickering candlelight casting dancing shadows on the walls. She would pour herself a cup of tea, the warmth offering only a slight comfort. She tried to read, to distract herself with stories of far-off lands and brave heroes, but the words would blur before her eyes as her mind drifted back to Andrew. One night, as she stared into the flames of the fire, a soft knock at the door startled her. She jumped to her feet, heart racing, hoping against hope that it was Andrew returned at last. Instead, it was Mrs. Ferguson, the estate's housekeeper, her face drawn and weary. "Mrs. McDonald, I thought you might want some company," she said gently, stepping inside. "You've been alone too long." "Thank you, Mrs. Ferguson," Georgia replied, forcing a smile as she poured another cup of tea. "I didn't mean to worry you." "Nonsense," the older woman replied, taking a seat across from her. "This storm has everyone on edge. Let's not pretend otherwise. You need to be strong for the girls, but you cannot bear it all alone." As the two women sat together, Georgia felt a little of the weight lift. They talked about everything and nothing. Gardening tips, stories of the Highlands and Mrs. Ferguson's own family. But beneath the surface, the worry for Andrew loomed like a dark cloud. Chapter 11. With each passing day, the ache of Andrew's absence grew sharper. One particularly dreary afternoon, the sky hung heavy with dark clouds that threatened to burst at any moment. Georgia gathered the girls and brought them inside, their laughter silenced by the oppressive atmosphere. They played games, trying to stave off the gloom that threatened to seep into their hearts, but the rain soon fell in sheets, the wind howling outside like a mournful cry. "Let's read a story, Mama," Clara suggested, her big brown eyes shining with enthusiasm. Georgia nodded, pulling them close as they settled onto a large rug in front of the fireplace, the flames crackling cheerily. As she read, her voice steady and warm, she imagined Andrew sitting beside them, his presence a comforting weight. Yet with every turn of the page, her mind wandered back to the letter, the promise of danger that hung like a spectre over their lives. That evening, as the storm raged outside, a sudden gust of wind rattled the windows. Georgia clutched the girls tighter, her heart racing. Just then, a figure appeared at the window, illuminated by the flickering light inside. She gasped, her breath catching in her throat, and hurried to the glass, fear clawing at her insides. But it was only a tree branch, swaying in the wind, its shadow dancing across the room. Relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. In that moment, she was reminded that the killer was out there, lurking in the shadows, and Andrew was still in danger. The following morning brought a hesitant calm as the rain subsided. Georgia took the girls outside, needing to breathe in the fresh, damp air that smelled of earth and pine. They wandered the grounds, collecting fallen branches and colourful leaves, trying to infuse some cheer into their days. But as the sun dipped low in the sky, a foreboding feeling settled in the pit of her stomach. The evening shadows stretched long, and once again she found herself sitting alone in the parlour, listening to the wind outside. The girls were asleep, and she was left with her thoughts. With each creak of the old house, her heart would leap, and she would glance towards the door, hoping to see Andrew walk through it. But it was always the same, just silence and the occasional patter of raindrops against the window. Just as she began to drift into a fitful sleep, a sharp knock echoed through the hall. Georgia bolted upright, her heart racing. She rushed to the door, half expecting the worst. But when she opened it, she found Mrs. Ferguson standing there, her expression grave. "Mrs. McDonald," she said urgently, "you must come quickly. There's news from London." Georgia felt a chill run down her spine, a sense of dread filling the air. "Is it about Andrew?" she asked, fear constricting her throat. "Yes," Mrs. Ferguson replied, ushering her into the hallway. "It's important." Together, they hurried to the sitting room, where a telegram lay waiting. George's heart raced as she unfolded it, dread settling in her stomach as she read the terse lines. "Killer apprehended. Significant losses. Return home immediately." Panic surged through her, and her hands trembled as she reread the message. "What does this mean? What happened?" she whispered, the fear rising in her throat. "I don't know, but we must prepare," Mrs. Ferguson said, her voice steadying Georgia. "We'll get through this together." The storm had returned, but this time it was not just the weather that raged outside. It was the tempest of uncertainty that swirled within Georgia's heart. The fight for their safety was far from over, and with each passing moment she clung to the hope that Andrew would return and they would face the storm together. Chapter 12. Andrew felt the familiar weight of duty settle heavily on his shoulders as he approached Scotland Yard, the grim facade of the building looming before him. It had been a tumultuous few weeks since he had left Georgia and the girls at the estate in the Highlands. Now he was back in London, the city that felt both like home and a prison, and the spectre of the killer loomed larger than ever. The atmosphere inside the yard was thick with tension. As he entered, he was greeted by a flurry of activity. Detectives huddled in groups, their voices low and urgent, clerks shuffling papers, and the scent of ink and wood polish hanging in the air. Andrew navigated the crowded corridors, his heart racing with anticipation and dread. The case had escalated alarmingly, and the pressure was mounting to put an end to the killer's reign of terror. He made his way to the office of Inspector Fields, a seasoned detective whose stern demeanour masked a fierce loyalty to his men. "McDonald," Fields greeted him, gesturing for Andrew to sit. "I trust your time in the Highlands was restful?" Andrew could only manage a tight smile, the memories of his family weighing heavily on his mind. "Not as restful as I had hoped, Inspector. I received word that the killer has struck again." Fields nodded grimly, sliding a file across the table. "It's worse than we feared. Multiple victims this time, all connected by a thread we've yet to uncover. We need your insight, MacDonald. You're familiar with the case more than any of us." Andrew took the file, flipping through the photographs that accompanied the reports. Each image was a chilling reminder of the brutality of the murders. The victims had all been found in alleyways, their lives snuffed out in a gruesome manner, and the message the killer left behind was a taunt, a twisted game of cat and mouse. Andrew's stomach turned as he processed the brutality, his resolve hardening. "This killer is getting bolder," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "We need to find a connection among the victims. There has to be something that links them together." Fields leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "That's what we're counting on you to discover. We've managed to gather some eyewitness accounts, but they've been less than helpful." Andrew gritted his teeth, frustration bubbling within him. "You mean uncooperative?" "Precisely," Fields replied, frustration evident in his voice. "Most people are too scared to talk. They don't want to get involved. But we need to push them. We need every detail, no matter how small." Andrew nodded, determination igniting within him. "Then we'll have to work quickly. If the killer is escalating, it won't be long before he strikes again." They spent the day poring over evidence and reports, Andrew's mind racing as he tried to piece together the puzzle. As evening approached, they prepared for a series of interviews with witnesses who had been near the crime scenes. Andrew felt a surge of adrenaline as they set out, the cool night air sending a shiver down his spine. They moved through the narrow gaslit streets of London, Andrew acutely aware of the shadows that crept along the cobblestones. The atmosphere was thick with unease, and he could feel the weight of the city's fear pressing down on him. They approached the first witness, a man who had been nearby when one of the murders occurred. "Mr. Whittaker," Andrew began, introducing himself as they entered the dimly lit tavern where the man was holed up. "We need your help. You were here on the night of the murder, correct?" The man shifted nervously, casting furtive glances around the room. "I don't know nothing, detective. I was just having a pint, minding my own business." Andrew pressed on, his instincts kicking in. "You heard the commotion, didn't you? Someone screaming?" Whittaker flinched, his face pale. "Aye, but I didn't see nothing. Just kept me head down." Andrew sensed the man was hiding something, but could not break through the wall of fear that enveloped him. "People are dying, Mr. Whittaker. If you know anything that could help us catch this killer, you need to speak up." "I swear I don't know nothing," the man insisted, his voice trembling. "I'd just as soon keep my mouth shut and live to see another day." Frustrated, Andrew took a deep breath and changed tactics. "What if I told you that keeping quiet could put you in danger too? The killer doesn't care who he gets." Whittaker's eyes widened, and for a moment Andrew thought he might finally crack. But then the fear returned and he shook his head vehemently. I can't. With a heavy heart, Andrew stepped away, recognizing that there were limits to what he could do. "Thank you for your time," he said curtly, turning to Fields. "We need to find someone who isn't paralyzed by fear." As they continued their search for leads, Andrew found himself feeling increasingly frustrated. Each witness seemed to retreat further into their shell, unwilling to offer even the slightest insight. Hours slipped away into the darkness of the night, and Andrew's hope began to wane. But as they approached the last witness of the evening, a woman named Mrs. Taylor, who had been out for a late walk, Andrew felt a flicker of determination reignite. The tavern she frequented was still open, its interior filled with the low hum of conversation and the clinking of glasses. They found her seated in a corner, her eyes scanning the room. "Mrs. Taylor?" Andrew asked, leaning down slightly so she could hear him over the din. "We're here to ask you about what you saw on the night of the murder." She looked up, her face lined with worry. "I don't want to get involved," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Please, It's important, Andrew urged. Anything you remember could help us catch this man before he kills again. As he spoke, Andrew noticed her eyes darting to the doorway. He's dangerous, you understand. Just then, the door swung open, and the figure that stepped inside sent a jolt of recognition through Andrew. It was the killer. Chapter 13. Instinct kicked in, and Andrew's heart raced as he caught a glimpse of the man's dark coat, the sharp features barely illuminated by the flickering gaslight. He felt the urgency of the moment coursing through him as the man scanned the room, a predatory gleam in his eyes. Without thinking, Andrew surged forward, adrenaline fueling his movements. "Stop!" he shouted, the word echoing through the tavern as patrons turned to look at him in confusion. But the man had already slipped out the door, disappearing into the night. Andrew cursed under his breath, frustration bubbling to the surface as he turned back to Mrs. Taylor. "Did you see where he went?" I think he headed down that alley," she stammered, pointing a trembling finger. Without waiting for further information, Andrew dashed out the door, the cold air hitting his face like a slap. He could feel fields right behind him, the thrill of the chase igniting their instincts. They raced down the narrow streets, hearts pounding as they navigated the shadows, following the trail of the killer. Andrew's breath came in sharp gasps, determination pushing him onward. He was so close to the answers he sought, but the city felt like a labyrinth, every turn leading deeper into the darkness. They reached the alleyway, the narrow passage lined with flickering lanterns that cast eerie shadows against the damp cobblestones. Andrew's heart raced as he rounded the corner, but the killer was nowhere in sight. "Damn it," he hissed, frustration spilling over. But then, a noise caught his attention, a faint sound, like a rustle coming from the other end of the alley. Andrew gestured for Fields to stay back as he crept forward, heart pounding in his ears. As he rounded the final corner, his breath caught in his throat. There, at the far end of the alley, stood the figure of the killer, backlit by the faint glow of a street lamp. Andrew's instincts screamed at him to act, to apprehend the man before he could escape again. But as he took a step forward, the figure turned, locking eyes with Andrew. The killer's expression morphed from surprise to malevolence, and in that split second, Andrew's heart sank as the man raised a hand, revealing a knife glinting in the dim light. Before Andrew could react, the killer took off, sprinting down the alley and into the shadows, and Andrew's mind raced with the realization that he was losing the very man who had brought their lives to this dark brink. "After him!" Andrew shouted, the adrenaline coursing through him as he took off in pursuit, knowing this chase would determine the fate of not just himself, but Georgia and their daughters as well. The chase through the dark streets of London was a blur of adrenaline and fury. Andrew's heart pounded in his chest as he pushed himself to the limits, the echo of his footsteps a relentless drumbeat against the cobblestones. The night air was thick with tension, the gaslights casting long shadows that danced like phantoms around him. He could hear the killer's footsteps ahead, each one a taunt, each stride a reminder of the horror he had inflicted on so many. "Stop!" Andrew shouted, his voice cutting through the cool night air as he rounded another corner. The killer glanced back, a glimmer of fear flashing in his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by a cruel grin. With a flick of his wrist, he turned and darted into a narrow alley, the darkness swallowing him whole. Fueled by a mixture of desperation and rage, Andrew followed, the adrenaline igniting every nerve in his body. The alley twisted and turned, littered with debris and the remnants of a city that had long since fallen into disrepair. A damp chill settled over him, but he pushed it aside, focusing only on the sound of his own breath and the footsteps that echoed in the night. The killer was fast, too fast, but Andrew was driven by a primal instinct, fueled by the thoughts of Georgia and their girls. He could almost hear their laughter, see the light in their eyes, and it gave him strength. But as he emerged from the alley, he found himself on a wider street, and for a fleeting moment he lost sight of his quarry. "Damn it!" he cursed, scanning the area. The street was alive with people, unaware of the danger lurking in the shadows. But Andrew had no time to waste. He spotted the killer slipping into a crowd, blending in like a spectre among the living. "Hey!" he yelled, forcing his way through the throng, determined not to let this man escape again. His legs screamed in protest, but he pushed the pain aside, fueled by the determination coursing through him. Suddenly, the killer turned, his expression twisted with malice as he spotted Andrew. With a sickening smirk, he drew a knife from his coat, the blade glinting under the gaslights like a serpent ready to strike. "You should have stayed away, detective," he taunted, his voice dripping with contempt. Andrew's blood boiled at the sight, a raw, primal rage igniting within him. "You won't get away with this," he shouted, advancing toward the man. The killer laughed, a cruel, mocking sound that echoed off the buildings. "You think you can stop me? You have no idea what you're dealing with." Without warning, the killer lunged forward, knife aimed for Andrew's chest. In a split second, Andrew sidestepped, adrenaline coursing through him as he grabbed the killer's wrist, twisting the knife away just in time. A quick scuffle ensued, the two men grappling with one another, the struggle intensifying as they tumbled onto the cobblestones. The impact jarred Andrew's leg, pain radiating through him, but he gritted his teeth against it. With a surge of strength, he pushed the killer away, scrambling to his feet just as the man lunged again. This time, Andrew was ready. He sidestepped once more and delivered a hard kick to the killer's side, sending him crashing against the wall. "You don't scare me, McDonald," the killer spat, regaining his footing and lunging again. But Andrew was fueled by rage, memories of his family driving him forward. As the killer swung the knife, Andrew ducked, feeling the blade slice through the air above him. With a surge of instinct, he grabbed the man's arm, twisting it behind him. The killer howled in pain, but Andrew didn't relent. He spun the man around and slammed him against the wall, using his weight to pin him down. "You're going to pay for what you did," Andrew growled, fury boiling in his veins. "Let go of me," the killer screeched, trying to break free, but Andrew had him secured. In a final desperate move, the killer's foot connected with Andrew's injured leg, pain shooting through him like fire. With a guttural roar, Andrew fell to his knees, the grip on the killer loosening for just a moment. In that instant, the killer twisted free and struck, the blade slicing deep into Andrew's right leg. He felt a sharp, searing pain that tore through him, and he grunted, falling back against the cobblestones. Blood pooled around him, the cold asphalt absorbing his life force as he gasped for breath. But Andrew was not done. Through the haze of pain, he fought against the darkness creeping into his vision. He rolled onto his side, struggling to push himself up, determination clawing its way through the agony. The killer loomed over him, a triumphant grin on his face as he raised the knife for a final strike. "No!" Andrew roared, summoning every ounce of strength within him. He reached out, catching the man's wrist and yanking with all his might. The killer stumbled, off balance, and Andrew seized the moment, shifting his weight and tackling the man to the ground. They grappled, Andrew's hands closing around the killer's throat, the world narrowing down to that singular moment, their lives intertwined in a desperate struggle for survival. The killer's eyes widened with shock and fear as Andrew choked the breath from him, a primal growl escaping his lips as rage fueled his actions. "I will protect my family," Andrew bellowed, the words tearing from his throat. The killer's face turned red, desperation evident in his eyes, but Andrew did not relent. He squeezed tighter, fueled by all the pain the killer had inflicted upon innocent lives, all the threats that hung over his family. With a final, shuddering gasp, the killer's body went limp beneath him, and Andrew released his grip, panting heavily as he collapsed back against the cobblestones. The world around him faded, and darkness closed in, the pain in his leg overshadowed by the rush of triumph. He had won, at a cost, but he had won. Chapter 14. When Andrew came to, the sterile smell of antiseptic filled his nostrils, and the faint beeping of machines surrounded him. Panic surged through him as he blinked against the harsh light, reality crashing in. He was in a hospital room, the white walls stark and unyielding. "Detective McDonald," a voice broke through the fog of his mind. He turned his head to see a doctor standing beside his bed, concern etched on his face. "You're safe now. You fought bravely, but you were severely injured." Andrew's heart raced as he struggled to sit up, wincing at the pain that shot through his leg. "Georgia, the girls, are they safe?" he croaked, his voice hoarse and strained. "They're safe," the doctor assured him, placing a comforting hand on Andrew's shoulder. "But you've sustained significant damage to your leg. You'll need to use a walking stick for the rest of your life. It will take time to heal, and there will be challenges ahead." Andrew felt as though the ground had shifted beneath him. A walking stick? The thought of being unable to run, to chase after his girls, was unbearable. Anguish washed over him as the weight of the world pressed down. "But I need to be there for them," he murmured, fighting against the tears that threatened to spill. "You will be," the doctor said firmly, his voice steadying. "With rehabilitation and time, you will adapt. You've been through an ordeal, and you survived. Focus on your recovery for now." As the doctor continued speaking, Andrew's thoughts drifted to Georgia and their daughters, the warmth of their love lighting up the darkness that surrounded him. He would fight through this, just as he had fought the killer, determined to be the father and husband they needed him to be. The battle was not over. It had only just begun. The sun rose over the Highland estate, casting a warm golden glow across the sweeping hills, but Georgia felt a chill settle deep within her. The message had come through, brief but harrowing. A telegram bearing news of Andrew's condition. Severely injured in the hospital, he needed her. As she stood in the parlour, her heart ached with the weight of uncertainty. The girls were playing outside, their laughter a stark contrast to the turmoil inside her. She took a deep breath, steadying herself against the reality of her husband's predicament. Andrew had faced danger before, but this was different. The threat had been real, palpable, and it had cut deep. "Anastasia, Margot, Lily," she called softly, gathering her daughters close. "Mummy needs to go to London for a bit. You will stay here with your aunts and uncles. I promise I will be back as soon as I can." Anastasia, the eldest at 5, looked up with wide, understanding eyes. "Is Daddy hurt?" she asked, concern creasing her small forehead. Georgia knelt down, taking her daughter's hands in her own. "Yes, sweet girl, but he's brave, just like you. He needs me to help him get better." Margot, 4 years old and full of spirit, chimed in, "I want to go with you." "I know, darling, but it's not safe just now," Georgia replied, brushing her daughter's hair back from her face. "I need you to be strong for Daddy. Can you do that for me?" The girls nodded, though the worry lingered in their eyes. Georgia hugged them tightly, a bittersweet moment filled with love and fear. "I'll be back soon," she promised, her voice firm despite the trembling in her heart. With the girls settled into the care of family members, Georgia embarked on her journey to London. The train rattled and swayed, each clack of the wheels against the tracks mirroring her anxious thoughts. The landscapes blurred past her, the beauty of the countryside lost on her as she focused solely on Andrew and the reunion that lay ahead. When she finally arrived at the hospital, the air was thick with the sterile scent of antiseptic. Her heart raced as she approached the ward where Andrew lay. a nurse nodded toward a room, and she took a deep breath, steeling herself for what lay beyond the door. Inside, the sight of Andrew sent a jolt through her. He was propped up in bed, a pale version of himself, his right leg heavily bandaged, but his eyes lit up at the sight of her. "Georgia," he breathed, a mix of relief and joy flooding his voice. "Andrew." She rushed to his side, her heart soaring and breaking all at once. She grasped his hand, feeling the warmth of his skin against hers. "Oh, my love, I was so afraid." "Just a scratch," he said with a weak smile, trying to lighten the mood. "You should see the other guy." Georgia laughed through her tears, pressing her forehead against his. "You brave, foolish man. What were you thinking?" "I was thinking I needed to protect you and the girls," he replied, his voice serious now. "I didn't realize how much danger I was in until it was too late." She felt a lump form in her throat, the weight of his words heavy in the air. "You don't have to do this alone anymore. I'm here now." They spent hours together, sharing stories and laughter interspersed with tears. Georgia learned about the final confrontation, the fight that had left Andrew wounded but victorious. Each detail drew them closer, forging an unbreakable bond forged in the fires of fear and love. Chapter 15. After a few weeks in the hospital, Andrew received the news he had been waiting for. As he sat in the small, sunlit room, the doctor entered with a serious expression. "Detective McDonald, your bravery is commendable. You fought hard, but your injuries are significant enough that it is in your best interest to retire from the force." Andrew's heart sank, a mixture of pride and sorrow washing over him. "What does that mean for my future?" "It means you will receive a pension, allowing you to care for your family without the burden of the force weighing over you," the doctor explained. "You've served honorably, and now it's time to take care of yourself and your loved ones." Andrew nodded, processing the gravity of the decision. "Thank you, Doctor. I appreciate everything you've done." He turned his gaze to Georgia, who sat silently in the corner, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. He had fought valiantly, but now a different kind of battle awaited him, one that involved healing and a new beginning. Once released, Andrew and Georgia made their way back to Scotland to retrieve their daughters. The journey was bittersweet, filled with an undercurrent of excitement and apprehension. Andrew leaned heavily on a walking stick, each step a reminder of his new reality, but he was determined to embrace this chapter of their lives. When they arrived at the estate, the girls ran to them, their little arms flinging around Andrew's waist. "Daddy, you're home!" Anastasia squealed, her voice bright and cheerful. Andrew's heart swelled as he knelt down to wrap them all in an embrace, the warmth of their love overwhelming. "I missed you girls more than you can imagine," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Over the next few days, they travelled through Scotland, taking in the lush landscapes, rolling hills, and the vibrant culture that enveloped them. They visited quaint villages and majestic castles, and Andrew found himself captivated by the beauty of the land and the laughter of his daughters. Each moment felt precious, a gift after the dark clouds that had hung over their lives. When their travels brought them to Ireland, Georgia marvelled at the lush green fields and the warmth of the people they encountered. They shared stories, laughter, and the kind of joy that reminded Andrew of what he had fought for. He may have lost his role as a detective, but he had gained something far more valuable: their family, unbroken and together. Finally, as they prepared to return to London, Andrew and Georgia felt a mixture of trepidation and hope. They had built new memories, but they also had a home to return to, one that had been their sanctuary before the chaos had begun. Chapter 16. When they arrived back in London, Andrew's heart raced as they approached the remnants of their cottage. The sight that greeted them was astonishing. The local community had banded together to rebuild their home, stronger and more beautiful than before. The quaint structure stood proud, painted a cheerful shade of blue, flowers blooming in the window boxes, and the front door wide open as if inviting them back. "What happened?" Andrew asked, astonished as he surveyed the scene. A neighbour stepped forward, a warm smile on her face. "After the fire, we couldn't let your family be without a home. We worked together to rebuild it, just the way you had it, but even better." George's eyes glimmered with tears of gratitude as she took in the scene. "This is incredible," she whispered, overwhelmed by the kindness of their community. "Welcome home," Andrew said, taking George's hand in his. Together, they walked through the door, the familiar scents and sounds embracing them like an old friend. Inside, the warmth of the cottage wrapped around them like a comforting blanket. The fire crackled in the hearth, and the girls rushed to explore their new haven, their laughter echoing through the halls. As Andrew settled onto the couch, he looked around at the life they had built together. The love, the laughter, and the memories waiting to be made. His heart swelled with hope for the future, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, hand in hand. In that moment, he realized that despite the pain and loss, they had emerged stronger, bound by the threads of love and resilience. Together, they would write the next chapter of their lives, one filled with warmth, adventure, and the unwavering bond of family. Chapter 17. Several weeks after settling back into their rebuilt cottage, Andrew received an envelope marked with the royal seal. His heart raced as he carefully opened it, revealing elegant, flowing script. The words danced before his eyes, a mixture of disbelief and pride swelling within him as he read. "Dear Detective McDonald, I extend my heartfelt congratulations on your remarkable bravery and your successful apprehension of the notorious killer who plagued our beloved city. Your courage and commitment to justice have not gone unnoticed, and it is my great pleasure to commend you for your exemplary service. In recognition of your outstanding contributions, I wish to offer you a position to assist in the capture of a dangerous criminal currently at large in Australia. This endeavour comes with a substantial remuneration, as well as titles of nobility should you accept. I eagerly await your response. With my highest regards, Her Majesty, Queen Victoria." Andrew sat in silence, the weight of the letter sinking in. He could feel George's curious gaze on him as she entered the room, a basket of fresh laundry cradled in her arms. "What is it, Andrew?" she asked, setting the basket down and crossing the room. "It's from the Queen," he replied, his voice a mix of excitement and apprehension. He held the letter out to her, watching as her eyes widened in surprise. "What does she want?" Georgia asked, scanning the elegant words. "She's commending me for catching the killer, and she wants me to go to Australia to pursue another," Andrew explained, the weight of the offer hanging heavily in the air. George's brow furrowed as she processed the implications. "And she's offering you a title? A position?" "Yes, and a lot of money," Andrew said, a hint of disbelief in his tone. "It's a great honour, Georgia, but, she prompted, sensing his hesitation. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't want to go back to that life. We've fought so hard for our family, for peace. If we were to travel to a new country, it would be to start fresh, not for work." Georgia nodded, her heart swelling with love for the man before her. "I agree. We've faced enough danger and heartache. Our focus should be on our girls, on creating the life we want here. If we ever travel to Australia, it should be for adventure, not as a job." Andrew felt a rush of relief at her words. "I'm glad you understand. I was worried you'd want me to take it." "Not if it means risking what we've built." she said firmly, reaching for his hand. Our family is what matters most. Together, they crafted a response to the Queen, thanking her for the honour, but respectfully declining the offer. They expressed their desire to focus on their family and their newfound peace. It was a moment that solidified their bond, a commitment to each other and their future. As the sun dipped low in the sky, painting the world in hues of gold and amber, Andrew and Georgia walked hand in hand up a gentle hill that overlooked the meadow where their daughters played. Laughter echoed in the air, a sweet melody of innocence and joy that tugged at their hearts. They settled under a sprawling oak tree, the cool breeze rustling through the leaves as they sat together, holding each other close. The warmth of the setting sun enveloped them, casting a golden glow over the landscape. "There's nowhere I'd rather be," Andrew murmured, resting his chin on top of Georgia's head. "Just us and our girls." Georgia smiled, her heart full. "We have everything we need right here." As they watched Anastasia and Margot twirling in the meadow, their laughter mingling with the soft rustle of the wind, Andrew and Georgia felt the weight of their past lift. The struggles, the darkness, the fear, it was all behind them now. In that moment, under the expansive sky, they realized that they had forged a life rooted in love, resilience, and hope. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, side by side, with their daughters always at the center of their world. And as the sun set on another beautiful day, Andrew whispered softly, "This is our new beginning." With the stars beginning to twinkle overhead, they held each other tighter, their hearts intertwined as they embraced the promise of a brighter tomorrow, together.